Hey guys, welcome back.
Hey,
Hey, how's it
s-
going, Mr. Nello?
how's it going?
Good.
This is perfect, Mr. McNally. We could see each other, they could see us, and we don't have to look at their faces.
Oh, thank God. I could probably teach for another 10 years if I don't have to look at another kid's face again?
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
have to look at yours though. So,
I'm sorry to hear that. So, anyway, class, we're going to get back to work here. So, last week we talked about evolution being a theory, not a fact, even though scientists have lots of evidence that makes us believe that evolution really happens. And there were four types of evidence that we mentioned, and we're going to start looking at them one by one today. That's you, Anello.
I'm up. All
You're
right. So
up.
the first one we're going to take a look at is fossil evidence, and everyone knows what fossils are: the remains of any past organisms preserved in rock or stone. Um, what we get from fossil evidence is that shows a couple of things. One, it shows us that there's organisms that existed before that aren't around today. So those are what's in the third bullet, extinct. And then there's also fossil evidence that shows us that slowly over time, organisms seem to gain complexity. And what I mean by that is if you find a fossil from a million years ago, and then you find the same fossil from that organism, let's say half a million years ago, you start to see some subtle differences and maybe the development of new features that weren't there previously.
Here's an example of a fossil of something that evolved probably into an alligator or a crocodile or something. But you can see that it's got a lot of structural similarities to alligators today, but it's not quite identical. So scientists can figure out that animals that used to live are very similar to animals that live today. So fossils form in layers of rock, and what happens over time is sand gets deposited in layers, layer on top of layer, and the oldest layers wind up at the bottom, and the youngest or newest layers are going to end up at the top.
Can you zoom out a little bit further on this one, Mr. McNally?
Sure. Maybe I can move it up.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. There. It's not very. It's very hypersensitive, this pad. All right. So therefore, the oldest fossils are at the bottom of the layers. Yes, Kelroy, I know that's where I would be. I got it. Haha. The if you go back in time, the oldest fossils are at the bottom, and then the newer ones get deposited years later above them. And as Mr. Nello said before, that the ones that are more complex will be at the top because life goes from simple to complex. Anything you want to add here, Mr. Nello?
Well, just that it makes sense that life starts out simple and gains complexity. You wouldn't, when you build something, you start off nice and easy and keep adding to it, and it becomes more complex over time.
Mm-hmm.
Same way with living things; they start off simple and they gain more complex characteristics slowly over time through evolution.
All right. So we're going to go on to the next type of fossil, not fossil, but the next type of evidence for evolution. And why is it not going the right direction? There we go. And that is
That's just
structural.
Mr. McNally's in charge of the computer right now, so I'm just here watching and going for a ride like you guys. All right.
And don't worry, hopefully it'll get better as we go. So the next thing are structural similarities. I guess it's up to you again, Mr. Nello.
All right. So what we're going to look at here is when we study organisms and you look at organisms that are closely related, you see a lot of the structures that make up, let's say, their arms, for example, are very similar in the way they are built. And the more similar the organisms are in their structures, then the more closely related they are. There we go.
Sorry.
Bring it back. You do that on purpose?
No, I didn't. I was trying to do something else, but all right.
All right. So if you look at these pictures of all these apes here, and we're included in there, the gibbon, the human, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the orangutan. Uh, we've talked about this before in class how we're closely related, but you can see that's supported by the way that, or the similarities that you see in our structures there. All right, the skeletons of all five of these creatures are very similar, probably more similar than they are different, and it makes sense because our DNA is over almost 99% similar to a chimpanzee's. It's about 98% similar to a gorilla's.
This one looks kind of like Larson, doesn't it?
Wow. Well, even over video.
I'm,
Larson, you're never safe.
you know, we only kid because we love, Michael. All right. So, did you want to look at homologous structures now, Mr. Nello?
Yeah, let's look at that one.
All right.
You want me to keep going with this one because it's what I was talking about?
Sure.
Then
I
you
don't
get
know
me
why it
down?
went that big, but okay. Here we go. All right. Here we go.
So this is what I was saying in kind of the similarities. If you look at the human arm, the cat front paw, the whale's fin, and the wing of a bat, you can see they're all built very similarly. You have one bone at the top, the humerus, attached to two bones, and then attached to many bones. All right, and that's the same in every single structure here. One bone attached to two, attached to many. And what happens over time is the individual bones have changed over time, and they've evolved to different ecosystems. So the human arm, even though it's the one bone attached to two bones attached to many bones, just like it's in a whale, evolved very differently because humans live in a very different ecosystem than a whale. But the important thing is that they are similar in their structure, so that suggests that they are closely related in terms of evolution.
All right. I don't know why it keeps going back to the original slide, but all right. The next one, the opposite of homologous would be analogous. And analogous here means that the structures have a similar function, but they have very different structures. And if you look at these examples, we have wings. So there's lots of organisms on the planet that can fly. There's bats that fly, which are mammals, birds, which are birds, obviously, and then insects, which have wings, and they all fly. But if you look at the structures, two of them have bones that are kind of adapted for flying with feathers or with skin folds here. But one of them has just got different type of structure altogether. It's made of something we call chitin. No bones, no skeleton. Even though all these organisms can fly, they all have the same function. They don't have the same structures. They're called analogous structures.
Can you go back to that picture real quick?
Sure.
So if you look at those three, you'd say two of them are more closely related than one, right?
Hopefully you'd all realize that the two that have the skeleton structure, the bones, are the ones that are closer related. And the insect's got a very different type of skeleton. It's got an exoskeleton.
If you compared, like, if you said, is a bat more closely related to a flying insect or a whale, you wouldn't talk about the ability to fly. You talk about how they're built. And since a bat's wing is built similarly to a whale's fin, they would be more closely related than a bat and an insect. So it's all about the structure, not the function.
So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. And the last type of skeletal structures we're going to look at are something called vestigial structures. I'll let you explain this one, Mr. Anello.
All right. These are structures that exist in our bodies or in any organism that are no longer used, and they kind of they shrink over time. They diminish, and not in the individual, but in the species over evolutionary time, over hundreds of thousands of years. And it just doesn't make sense for the organism to put energy into building a structure that it's not going to use. That energy would be better suited building stronger organs that are needed. All right. So if you look at the first picture, it shows at the bottom of our spine, there's still remnants, small bones from where our common ancestors had a tail. We don't have a tail any longer. Our wisdom teeth, they're somewhat vestigial because in some adults they never even break the surface, and in most cases they're removed because they're impacted or they're not growing correctly. And then if you look at the snake, there's some snakes that still have in their skeletons remnants of legs, which doesn't mean that they'll ever grow legs. It just means that they share a common ancestor with organisms or reptiles that do have legs. All right, so the existence of our tailbone doesn't just mean that we came from something with a tail. It also means that we share common ancestors with organisms that do have tails today.
Another thing that we have that's vestigial is our appendix. I don't know if anyone in the class has had their appendix removed. I know of one person who's had their appendix removed, Mr. Anello.
I have. Yeah.
But so you don't need it. Do you miss it, Mr. Anello? Do you miss your appendix?
Sometimes.
Yeah. So. But it doesn't do anything for us, but there are ancestors of ours used the appendix to digest certain kinds of plant material that our stomachs can handle now without needing an appendix. So it's vestigial. What does vestigial tell us about evolution? Well, it tells us that snakes evolved from animals that used to have legs, that humans evolved from apes probably with bigger mouths that used to have more need for these extra teeth, and that humans evolved probably from animals that had a tail at one point. So we can use vestigial organs as another um, evidence for evolution. You ready to move on to the next one, Mr. Nello?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Embryology.
We
So,
went halfway.
what's that?
We went forward first. I thought we were going to go
Yeah,
backwards.
no, I figured it out. There's arrows at the bottom here. You can use them
Oh,
to
okay.
guide you. So, embryos. We all came from embryos. Every living thing on the planet starts out as an embryo if it's made sexually. And when we looked at uh, human sexual reproduction, we saw the whole zygote turn into an embryo. Well, the same stages from zygote to 2 cell, 4 cell, morula, blastula, gastrula, they all look the same. And if you even go further in embryology and you compare some pictures of different animals with backbones, whether it's a fish or a salamander or a turtle, chicken, rabbit, or human, we all go through very similar stages and look very, very similar in the early development. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that if all these animals go through very similar processes in their development, they probably evolved from or came from a common ancestor somewhere back in time.
Now, is there a way to tell how recently that those common ancestors are shared between organisms?
You're asking me, you're asking the class because they can't answer, Mr. No.
I'm asking anyone.
Okay. I don't see any hands.
No, me neither.
So, so
Who would raise their hand? Who would always raise their hand?
Chris Gonzalez.
Oh, he would. Okay, so we're gonna let him explain now. So we'll just wait for him to.
We'll wait for
pop
Chris to tune in.
You want to click on that other diagram there?
Yes.
All right. So if you look at this one here, there's a fish, a salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human. These are animated, drawings. But if you look at the human, and you go down the 3 rows, the 3 columns, you see that the human embryo looks a lot like the rabbit embryo for a longer period of time than it does if you compare it to the fish or the salamander. So the longer the embryos resemble one another, the more closely related they would be. And this kind of makes a lot of sense on if you look at an evolutionary tree. A fish and a salamander, so fish and amphibians are very closely related. And then reptiles and birds are very closely related. And if you look at theirs, they still look very similar in the bottom row. And then the rabbit and human, both being mammals, they still look very similar during their late stages of embryonic development there. So the longer the similarities exist, the more closely related the organisms are, and the more recently they share a common ancestor.
Sounds good. And then the most recent evidence we have for evolution is biochemical discoveries. And as you know, back in the 1950s, they did discover the DNA molecule. And from there, they've learned that DNA is the template for building things like enzymes and hormones. So this is called biochemical evidence that we can look at now. We weren't able to do that in the past, but in modern science we can. And by doing things like gel electrophoresis, we can compare the DNA of different species. So if we look at, let's pretend that this is a human, a chimp, an orangutan, and a gorilla. If you compared the DNA of 4 different species, you could find out which are most closely related. And in this case, it might look like the orangutan and gorilla down here at the end have these 2 bases in common. So you could kind of make the comparison between species just by looking at the DNA or the enzymes or hormones that they share.
And we did one of those in class, right?
We did. Yeah, we did one when we did gel electrophoresis for part of the DNA unit. So that's the best evidence. And you always know this is the best because that's the one they use to try to prove paternity or try to decide whether or not 2 people are related. They don't look at the shape of somebody's nose or the eye color so much as they look at the DNA. Anything you want to add, Mr. Nell?
No, I think you got that one.
Makes sense?
Yeah, good job.
Thank you. So I kind of just answered the question. Let's see if they paid attention. Which evidence is the most accurate? The fossils, the similar structures, the embryology, or the biochemistry?
Oh, it's definitely number 2, right? Because both the ones that have spots must be closely related.
I want you to stop the video, Mr. Nell, and I want you to rewind and go to the last slide and hear what Mr. McNally said. And
Okay.
then you'll have the answer. So, anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed seeing us for this unit. We're going to have an assessment, Mr. Nell. You said you're going to make one?
Yeah, they'll have some questions on this. That'll be today's lesson, and we'll move forward. Maybe we'll try to do this again.
And can I just say something to the class? Since we made this video for you guys showing our faces, it would be really great if you would start showing your faces in the messages and start like checking in with us and seeing, asking for help, because it's kind of boring it being one way. Would you agree, Mr. Nello?
Yeah, it's nice. We are hearing from some of the students, and it is nice.
It is nice, yeah. So I appreciate the ones who've checked in, but that's the minority, right? Would you say? Only a few?
Yeah,
Yeah.
very few.
All right, guys. We'll do this again. Have a good one.